Thank you so much for coming to the session Secrets and Lies. So this session is going to explore the resurgence of archive and testimony in history filmmaking over the past few years. And with me, I have a panel of producers and contributors from some of the BBC's most recent projects in history. So over the course of the next hour or so, we'll be discussing the opportunities that are afforded by using archive and testimony, the challenges of making and or featuring in series of this kind, why our panel think that this kind of storytelling is popular again, and we'll explore the ethical issues that come from making contemporary history films. So let me introduce you to the panel. So first of all, this is David Glover. David Glover is the CEO of 72 Films and the executive producer of the Assad series. Steve Condi, sitting next to me, is the executive producer of the Thatcher series, which is currently on air on BBC Two.
And I'm not Michael Dobbs. I'm sorry about that.
And he's not Michael Dobbs, who is in the published brochure, but will be as entertaining as Michael Dobbs, I'm sure. Mat Bickley, sitting to the right of me, was a contributor and a member of the family in Stephen, the Murder That Changed the Nation. And Liza Williams, I got it right, I think. Did I get it right? Good. Was the series director on the Yorkshire Ripper Files, which played earlier this year on BBC 4. So I'm just going to start, and I should say who I am. I'm Tom McDonald, and I work in commissioning at the BBC. So I'm just going to start by showing a little brief montage of the series that we're going to be focusing on today. So let's show the montage. So I guess one of the interesting things just watching those clips is just if you think about the last 50 years, it is the first area in which pretty much history as it happens can be filmed and captured in such extraordinary detail. So I wanted to start by asking each of the panellists, and I'll start with David. What made you want to tell this story, so the story of the Assads and their regime?
Well, I think that the story itself raises a lot of interesting questions in terms of it's the story of someone who was an eye doctor, junior doctor practicing in West London, who goes on to run the Syrian dictatorship that we know today. And I suppose actually it was really kind of Tom who commissioned it in the first place, who said it's interesting in a way that sort of Stalin sort of had a plan, or Hitler had a kind of plan, some sort of dark and perverted philosophy. These guys seem to have got to where they've got to by a series of incremental steps, and sort of I think it'd be interesting to look at those incremental steps and kind of try and sort of work out kind of which places one could have gone a different way, and almost kind of on that moral slippery slope, kind of where one could have got off that slippery slope. So that seemed like a kind of extremely sort of profound set of questions to try and sort of tackle. And then obviously there was this sense of there being this kind of incredible wealth of archive, and if we could marry it with this testimony, we could try and make a kind of almost like a box set documentary series, which has the kind of qualities of a drama box set, but is actually real. And fact, as we know, is kind of often more incredible. It's stuff you wouldn't believe in fiction, you get in factual stories. And the story of this eye doctor going on to be where he is today felt like a kind of extraordinary thing to embark on.
And it's interesting because I remember when we first started talking about the Assad series, I think we were both drawn in different ways to the sort of enigma at the heart of it, which is Bashar al-Assad. So part of it, I think, is when you were making the series, are you looking at that sort of central character? Is that an important part of how you shape a series like this?
Yes, I think that sort of, with a series like this, it's sort of, you kind of want to be on board with your central protagonist in a way as much as possible. I mean, it seems kind of trite to compare it to a drama box set, but someone once said to me that kind of in The Sopranos, Tony Soprano is pretty much on screen in every scene virtually. And if you veer too far from your kind of central character, but he's the sort of central protagonist, him and Asma really, the central protagonist in a sort of tragedy, as I see it. And so, yeah, you want to kind of, you don't want to veer too far away from that central story, because that was our interest in terms of their sort of tragedy.
I'll move on to you, Steve, because of course there is a central figure at the heart of the title gives the central figure away. But in Thatcher, it'd be good to know what drew you to Thatcher and delivering a big series about Margaret Thatcher and why you wanted to make that series now.
I think probably 3 reasons. I mean, personally, I've made a lot of programmes about Britain in the post-war era, social history, politics programmes, how we've expressed ourselves in art and music and culture, who we are. And therefore, for me personally, she is a really, obviously, dominant figure in that whole story and is therefore utterly irresistible. Secondly, I think she herself is just an irresistible character. Her sheer force of personality and her presence in our culture is extraordinary, actually. And, we all sit in this room, I think, very conscious of how influential she has been in all our lives. We all probably would not be here in one way or another if it wasn't for what she did and her government did in the country. And that's pretty attractive proposition to go and examine that. And also because she has become, statuesque, and really wanted to sort of scratch at the surface of that a little bit and see what was behind what has become a kind of caricature. And that was a really fascinating thing to do. And also she allows you to examine really important themes, class and gender and power, and who has it and how did he use it. So all of that combination made it an utterly irresistible thing to take on. Really.
I mean, I think one of the things we'll talk about is sort of the themes that emerge in these things, but I think power and who wields it is sort of at the heart of all these series to some degree. Liza, do you want to talk a little bit about Yorkshire Ripper and what motivated you to be involved? Because in some ways it's the antithesis of Thatcher, because it's not a series really about the Yorkshire Ripper. So what drew you to that story?
Well, probably precisely that. I mean, I think there's been a lot of documentaries made about the Yorkshire Ripper case. A lot of them focus on the killer, on the man, on who he was. I and the execs and everyone else that worked on this project, none of us were interested in that. We wanted to come at it sideways, really, come at it in a completely different way and look at what was going on in society at that time, what meant that the investigation went the way it did, why did it happen that way. 13 women were killed, it went on for 6 years, there were lots of opportunity to catch the killer, why didn't it happen earlier? And looking at sort of themes of misogyny, class, race, all those things, how did that all play into this case and influence the people investigating it, but also the public, the press, everybody involved. This wasn't just about police attitudes, it was about attitudes, throughout society, really.
Matt, you obviously come from a very different perspective because you weren't a producer of Stephen, The Murder That Changed a Nation, you were a contributor. Can you tell us a little bit, because obviously Stephen's story has been told. Stephen's story has been told in various ways.
Sure.
What made you decide to participate in the series?
I guess firstly, the amount of time that had elapsed from the initial incident and the age that I was when that happened was 21. So 25 plus years have gone by, and in many respects the dust had settled, I suppose, and I felt in a place where I could be somewhat more impartial about the story. The quality of the output from Rogan Productions historically and projects that they've been involved in, I felt that this was going to be a kind of a well-rounded, impartial look at the story. It was important to me that previous incarnations have been quite one-sided, I suppose, and I kind of wanted the truth to be presented, however ugly that may be. It's almost like there is a certain consensus amongst the people that contributed or who lived through this experience in the first hand that the expectation is that everyone's going to have a relatively sort of liberal view on things and have the same opinion that most right-minded people have. But I kind of wanted to see the ugly side as well, presented in the same forum. So I kind of had a sense which is borne out to be true, that it would be handled really, really respectfully and not sensationally. I just wanted to see how they would kind of create this timeline, which only the distance, it's taken 25 years to kind of put all the pieces of the jigsaw together to now present this story in a kind of, it almost has a beginning, a middle and an end now. And I think if you try to tell this story at any other time, you'd only be somewhere in the middle of the story.
And had you been approached before about participating in films?
Not so much films. Definitely I've been approached lots of times earlier on in the first few years after Stephen's death, because I was heavily involved in the campaign. I was approached, but I've always felt I didn't want to be a puppet in somebody else's news agenda, and I think it's all too easy, especially when you're talking about race, ultimately, to be kind of pigeonholed and kind of used as a vox pop for an agenda that's got nothing to do with you. Immediately after this documentary aired, the news agency got onto me and were trying to kind of get my opinion on knife crime in London, and I'm like, I don't have one. I have a personal opinion, but I don't see how it's relevant to my current status as a member of the family in the context of this documentary. I don't really want to put my opinion up as part of the kind of news agenda that was being created around the re-emergence of the discussion around Stephen and Stephen's murder. So, I've been approached over the years, but this was the first opportunity I felt to go on record and almost draw a line under it. There's not much more. Anything now is about the future and about hope. I don't think there's anything more that can be said about the story from an historic perspective that hasn't been extremely well articulated in this documentary.
I mean, it's interesting because I would say that all of you in different ways have touched on this, but I guess Matt, you just said that, with the benefit of distance, 25 years on, Steve talking about how Margaret Thatcher's become almost sort of statuesque figure, I think was your phrase. So I guess my question to all of you, but I'll start with Liza, is why make this series now? Like, why bother doing it? We know these stories. You could Wikipedia it or read a Guardian article or find out about it your own way. Why bother to go to the effort to make a series?
I think often when you have a passage of time, you see things differently. And I think that was definitely true with our series. We looked through all the archive and were astonished at the things that were coming back at us, really, the same repeated lines about the victims. And I don't feel I've seen that before. And I think if you'd have made it closer to the actual event, it wouldn't have been as obvious. I think that those attitudes were entrenched at that time, so it wouldn't have jumped out at you in the same way. I think also because I'm from a different generation, I have got completely fresh eyes. I don't remember this case, I wasn't born. And so I was looking at it without any sort of preconceived ideas, really. And I think you get something very different from that, as long as you do it in that way and as long as you focus on those aspects as opposed to focusing on the salacious details of the case.
So you had that distance partly because you weren't born when the Yorkshire Ripper was around, well, not revealing your age, but Steve, I think you've mentioned that you grew up...
I'm definitely not revealing my age.
Yes, exactly. that you grew up with Margaret Thatcher as our Prime Minister. So for you, what was the benefit of sort of that distance?
This was commissioned for the most boring reason that things are ever commissioned in television, which is that there was an anniversary.
It's not the only reason it was commissioned.
No, I know. But I think that it did feel peculiarly timely for two big reasons. I think one is that if you think about Thatcher and Thatcherism and what it represented in the kind of post-war story of Britain, it was the period in which, a certain idea about the economy felt like it had won. The right had sort of won the argument about the economy. And then in the period since she was in power, the left felt like it had won the argument about society, if you like. So we were a sort of tolerant society with a sort of liberal market economy. And those two things feel a bit up for grabs at the moment, actually. So, there feels like there's a renewed debate about the nature of the economy, and there's a renewed debate about the nature of our society. So it felt very timely for that reason. And obviously you and young Simon Young over there were incredibly perspicacious and knew that there was going to be a crisis in the Tory party leadership at exactly the time the programme was on.
We were tipped off.
Yeah, exactly. Your insider knowledge was impeccable. So it felt remarkably timely for that reason as well. But, you know, the other thing is what the contributors were able to bring to it with the benefit of a bit of distance. So the last time a big Thatcher series was made was in the 93, I think, just a couple of years after she left Downing Street, and it was fantastic. It was called Downing Street Years. It was a brilliant series made by Dennis Blakeway, and it had everybody being fantastically catty about each other. And but they were all still doing it in the immediate aftermath of the event of her eviction from Downing Street. Doing it just that kind of, you know, a couple of decades later, it gives them all a little bit more pause for reflection and insight, and try and get a sense of what they really felt about her, and to be more candid about it as well, actually, and more frank. And therefore, I think I had a sort of a kind of more depth to what we understand about her than you could get in the immediate aftermath.
And because of course, we thought that Michael Dobbs would be sitting in your seat. We do have a clip featuring Michael Dobbs. Shall we, from the Thatcher series, shall we show a clip from Thatcher? Still a bit catty.
It's a bit catty. There's still quite a lot of cattiness in there, I have to admit. Very enjoyable cattiness. But, you know, that was in last night's, the programme which went out last night, which is where you start to really see the relationship between her and some of the people who've been closest to her as she's risen to power start to sour. And he was on the sort of wrong end of her growing paranoia, I think we'd have to say.
I mean, it's interesting with the Thatcher series because you interviewed an extraordinary array of people who lived through her time in office. That's not something that you, David, really had the same opportunity to be able to do with Assads for obvious reasons that, you know, that we didn't interview the Assads themselves. How did you get round that challenge, which is, you know, if you're doing a classic history archive series, you go, well, line up you know, all the greats who knew those people. How did you approach that with the Assad series?
Well, I mean, we did approach the Assad family, and I mean, there were various people I still wish we could have had in the series. Bashar al-Assad's uncle, who was exiled by his father, drives a Rolls Royce around Mayfair apparently, and Asma's parents still I believe live in Croydon, where kind of Harrods bags are delivered to their door sometimes, and protesters sometimes spray red paint on their front door. And we were very much hoping that some of those people would participate. We also, at one point, had the blessing to go to Damascus, if you remember. And then the BBC did something which upset them, and they kind of shut the gates down. But we did make that approach. I mean, in terms of, we tried in our first instance to just sort of interview people that were in the room and in the archive, as it were. So we did have lots of sort of former cabinet ministers or people that worked with the family. So we were trying to tell a sort of quite an inside story. And then we also had some people that have really studied it in depth. But I suppose, I mean, there's a number of things to say a bit. One is kind of in terms of the sort of why now that you were asking earlier, I think there's a sort of dramatic irony to that story, which I think is really helpful for this kind of series when you sort of know how it ends. I think that's part of the reason sort of that films like Senna work, is that you know it sort of ends in tragedy. And I think this sort of sense of building towards that tragedy. But I guess your question here is about, maybe more about balance, is it? In terms of like, how do you kind of balance it? And that's very complicated, I suppose, because obviously we were hearing mainly from people who are huge opponents of the regime, or had been inside the regime and then sort of defected. But I suppose balance, I think, is quite a tricky thing, because I think when you've got someone who's sort of, barrel bombing and gassing their own population, the sort of kind of fairly representing their views is complicated. But you hope that you're just going to try and just tell the story and let the viewer decide as much as possible, if that makes any sense. But obviously they were kind of limited in the sense that they wouldn't take part in it, and I wish they had.
So one of the things that I think, I'd like to stay on that for a second with you, David, if that's all right, because I think one of the things interesting, for me at least, when I watched the Assad series, and I don't know how many of you have seen it, is that even though Bashar and Asma have done heinous things, or overseen heinous crimes at least, they are still recognisably human, or at least start out as recognisably human. And it'd be good to know if that was sort of a surprise to you, that you end up feeling a level of sympathy for them, whether it was intentional, like what your take on Bashar and Asma is now.
Well, I suppose the intention, to start with that, was to just lay it out and sort of not take a side and to be as balanced as possible. And I kind of feel with this kind of thing, you really want to just sort of let the viewer, in a way, decide. I think the central question, as I sort of said earlier, is almost sort of, how come this eye doctor and his wife, who you could have met in 1995 walking around London at a dinner party or something, how could they be at the centre of this? And essentially, I think there are sort of two ways people think about it. Some people think that actually there was something rather wrong with those two, and they're slightly sort of psychopathic characters. And a lot of people say that. And other people say, no, I think it actually suggests more that any of us could have done this, and that almost any of us might be more capable of something like this if you look at all the incremental steps along the way than perhaps we'd like to realise. And I don't try and take a view in the programmes, but my personal view is closer to the second one. In terms of just the filmmaking, and in a way it connects to what you said about staying on the focus of them, I think in a way to understand anyone, you have some degree of sympathy with them. And we sort of talked a bit pretentiously, partly because the contributors did, about Shakespearean tragedies. And sort of if you're kind of on board with Macbeth or Richard III, or whoever it might be, even Richard III, you might have a degree of sympathy with. And I think this is more like Macbeth, that once they start crossing moral lines, it's very hard to know when to stop. So when you've started killing protesters or journalists or whatever, it's very hard. Once you're covered in blood, you kind of go, it's hard to know when to get off. So that's sort of my view. I don't see them as psychopaths. I see them, and I do have a degree of sympathy for them. But I think that, more sympathy for the people that I saw in the documentary yesterday for Salma. If you haven't seen, watch that. That's sort of my view.
So obviously the Assads have overseen crimes against their own people, but sort of going to more domestic crime. Obviously crime programming has seen an enormous resurgence. I think partly you might argue from starting with Making a Murderer and the podcast Serial, and that has grown and grown from there. I want to get into the sort of morality and ethics around that subject area. So there is and this is a bit mean of me, but there is a review from The Guardian which describes the recent Madeleine McCann series, which called it a moral failure. It offered no new facts, no new insight. It didn't even have a point of view. And I think part of the reason that I'm sort of reading out that quote is to try and get at, did you, in particular, Liza, but David as well, think about those things? Like if you are, so we'll go into Yorkshire Ripper first of all, but when you're thinking about Yorkshire Ripper, obviously many of the victims' children, husbands, parents in some cases are still alive. How do you navigate through the moral quandary of that when you know that to some extent people are watching? You're hoping that people watch it and get hooked on it, so that after they've watched episode 1, they're desperate to watch episode 2, and episode 3 you're sort of box setting real life tragedy. How did you go about dealing with that?
I think it's a real balance, but I think that the reason, to be honest, it was always at the forefront of my mind, always. I think from the very beginning when we started filming, because we had a very, very clear idea of why we were making it. We had intent, really. We knew that we didn't want to make this to just focus on the gory details, to just focus on the fact that, a serial killer in a typical way. We wanted to understand why it had happened, and to understand what as a society went wrong, really, and how that might still feed into today. And because we had that ethos, it meant, I think, that we were able to add meaning into what we were doing, and it wasn't just a straightforward, focusing on the horrible things that happened, which I think is the danger. Because like you say, when you're trying to create drama and when you're trying to make people watch, it's easier to fall back on those things. And I think especially when you're in the edit and you're panicking a bit or things aren't going quite the way you wanted it to go, it's easier to to stick something in that really shouldn't be there, to use something in a salacious way, to use music in a salacious way. And it was just a constant resistance to that, really. Constantly trying to make sure that everything we put in had a reason, that it in some way, you know, shed light on what we were saying, that it added to the overall theory of the series, and just constantly interrogating that, really.
What was the most challenging thing for you ethically in that series, though? Were there things where you, whether you were in the cutting room or doing interviews, where you sort of found yourself going, can I do that? How far can I push that? What was the hardest question for you?
Well, I think there were 13 women that died in this case, so that's 13 families. So that's 13 sets of people that you can potentially really, really upset. And that's quite a stressful thing to be worrying about, because you're not making it to upset people, but at the same time, you do have to tell the story. And there are a lot of facts in this case that are in the public domain and that you have to tell in order to make sense of what happened. And I think it was just making sure that we treated everything with just as much respect as possible. And if we were using something like a crime scene photograph, which obviously could really, really upset a member of the family, that there was genuinely an editorial reason to do it, and we weren't just using it just because we wanted a picture to put on the screen. And it was interrogating every single thing that we put in, so that nothing slipped through, I think. That's the important thing. It's got to be constant. You've got to always be thinking about it.
So should we now show a clip from Yorkshire Ripper? Your voice is obviously on that clip, and you are the voiceover, the author, director of the series. So in some ways you sort of sit on the lines between being the maker and a contributor. How did you feel about sort of being an active part of that story for the audience?
Well, I think when you're not used to doing that, it feels quite strange initially. But I think the further we got into the process, the more glad I had that device, really, because it meant that I could comment on things and highlight why we were using something in a way. So we'd use a bit of archive that might have a very insensitive description of a victim, that if you didn't have some kind of comment on, might just feel we put it in there just for something shocking to put in. But because I was able to comment on it, it meant that there was most definitely an editorial reason to use it. And you know, clearly we were using those things to say, this is what went wrong, this was the problem here. So it was very, very helpful in that way.
Is that the first time your voice has been used on a series?
Yeah.
And did that feel exposing for you,
very.
just as a filmmaker?
Yeah, very. Because you feel that you're really putting your name to it. You feel that you might personally be judged or might be criticised for what you've done, and that sort of, it does inevitably mean that you feel even more responsible, I think, really, because you're very much, it's you know, your name is on that, you know, and viewers will see that and associate you with it.
I mean, I think the other interesting thing is that we also live in a time where it's no longer, it's on the telly once and then it's on iPlayer or wherever, a platform for a couple of days. Essentially, people will be able to access these films forever. And I want to talk just very briefly about, with Thatcher, one of the things that's interesting to me is while the programme's going out every week, if you type Thatcher into Twitter, it's a sort of barrage of hate. I would say sort of 80% hate, followed by some people going, if only she were the Prime Minister still. Did you think at all about Margaret Thatcher's family, Steve?
I just want to read this first.
Okay.
Twitter last night. Don't forget, Thatcher was an evil, rhymes with Jeremy Hunt. Don't listen to the BBC, she was a sociopath. Watching the Thatcher documentary right now, she's what the country needs, wish we could bring her back. And yeah, I mean, we did think about her family, and we spoke to her kids, neither of whom wanted to take part ultimately, although I did have some interesting conversations with Mark. And I think that, you know, they've lived so long with the understanding of their mum's position in the country and being exposed to those kind of very divisive feelings that she elicits, that they're kind of over it a little bit, you know what I mean? I think they just don't have the sort of exposure to the kind of potential hurt, the same kind of sensitivity to the subject matter that you guys had in your programme, or even some of the people involved in David's programmes. So I think there was, we were very conscious of their sort of presence in the background, and were very diligent about making sure they were comfortable with what we were doing and understood what we were doing and were invited to participate in that. Ultimately they didn't want to take part. They've seen a lot of programmes about their mum, and they've made a sort of conscious decision that they can't really add to it, so we didn't push them to participate.
Can I talk to you, Matt, about your participation? You said before that you, I guess, did your due diligence about James Rogan and the films that he'd made before, but were there within your circle, your family circle and other friends of Stephen, people who chose not to participate? What was the sort of decision-making process for you and your family group?
We didn't sit at a conference table and kind of decide as a collective. I think everyone's decisions were personal. I didn't have any real kind of conversation other than, I guess, sort of seeking some form of tacit permission out of respect from Doreen or Joy. It's kind of a difficult one. There's the outside story, and then it's how it's affected us as a family over the generations. And I think, as with all families, there's a dynamic shift and a power shift that's constantly at play. And so I kind of wanted to be mindful of not stepping on anyone's toes, but at the same time, I felt personally that I hadn't had an opportunity to go on record completely. So it was important to me to do that. But we didn't sit down and kind of discuss a contribution. I know that Stuart, Stephen's brother, didn't want to participate at first, and I think he hadn't had good experiences previously, and I don't think he took the time to maybe kind of research the guys as I had, and he didn't have a knowledge of film and documentary to kind of be reassured by that. It's only since the programme's been made that he's done some work with the guys on some programming for the BBC schools programmes. So it's kind of, with the benefit of hindsight, he's kind of decided to participate. But I think for me, it was, to your point, it was just really important that that this wasn't sensationalist or wasn't a sort of a tabloid approach, which generally speaking had been the kind of things that people wanted to do. And that's why I felt kind of confident to participate. Also, I think my involvement sort of evolved over the process. So initially I was only really meant to do like a kind of a 2-minute vox pop. But in discussion, the interview process, I think we were meant to sort of be doing this interview for maybe like 30 minutes. About 4.5 hours later, I was still sitting in the chair, still having this conversation with James. And then in the edit, I think I was quite privileged. I don't think many people that are the subject of these kind of programs would have the access that I had to provide context, cultural context to the programming. So I had a say on the audio and the music that was being used to sort of soundtrack a generation, to place that in the context of my personal truth, the Britain that I grew up through, which by definition will be other people will have an affinity to, but it very much was coming from, this was the music that we as a family and friends were listening to. You may have the same experience, but so you have an affinity, but it wasn't consciously trying to think of how other people would perceive it in that respect.
Can I ask you a little bit more about just for maybe some people in the audience who don't know the Stephen Lawrence story or what happened to Stephen, just what was the story that you felt you wanted to tell? You've said a few times now in the panel that there were things you felt you needed to say. What were those things?
I think it's just a personal thing. I think it's just more about, I was 21 when Stephen was murdered. I'm just recently turned 48. In terms of Stephen's story's impact on our nation and as a historical kind of a piece of history, contemporary history, I felt it was important for me on a personal level to go on record somehow, officially, and say my piece. And so for me it was about talking about my personal involvement, the impact it's had on me personally, without being morose but it's, yeah, I just never, in every other attempt to kind of for me to kind of speak about this subject, about Stephen's life, it was always with an agenda in mind. And this to me felt like it was simply about trying to get my personal truth out there, and which is subjective, of course, but I like the idea that there were so many contributors that somehow through multiple versions of people's personal truths that we would find some kind of consensus, and therefore that would be the closest we could get to fact, and kind of once and for all kind of have a kind of definitive storytelling that is as close to a kind of consensus of what the truth actually was. It's how many times people people feel so connected personally to this story for so many different reasons, you know, either police corruption or racism, or, you know, there's lots of different aspects to this story that resonate with people, and therefore it kind of felt important to participate in something that felt like a definitive truth, I suppose.
And do you think it was a definitive truth, the series?
I think it's just, yeah, I mean, I think the approach is the kind of investigative journalism aspect of this was kind of very microscopic. I mean, I had over the years, I had a box in the attic of minutes that I'd kept from town hall meetings and kind of notes that I'd written for pamphlets that I'd produced, and, you know, just every kind of the detritus and bits of stuff that you would never open that box again, because it's kind of actually quite kind of boring. Those guys went through everything with a microscope, and then they pieced it together kind of on like a post-it note board to kind of go, well, this happened on that date, and then that news story came out the day after, so what was the connection? And they kind of took that approach to it, which I've never seen anyone be that methodical before in an attempt to kind of get at what actually happened.
I'm going to show a clip now from Stephen, and then I've got a few more questions for you, Matt, if that's okay. So here's a clip from Stephen. So I want to talk a bit about your experience being interviewed, because it's interesting to me that you said what started out as a sort of quick interview turned into 4.5 hours.
Maybe more.
Maybe more. On an emotional level, sort of, I understand that, you know, you felt a sort of a need to be part of the definitive story, but on an emotional level, what was it like going back to do that interview and reliving the harrowing experience you'd gone through?
It's quite cathartic. Probably like one of the most harrowing therapy sessions you could sit through. Because I hadn't realised until sitting in that chair that I hadn't personally revisited my 21-year-old self. And through conversation, it kind of takes you right back to that time. And with the benefit of time as well, you have recollections of things that you've completely put out of your mind. Life, as we all know, is just about kind of finding a way to go forward, and you put things, you compartmentalize them and put them away. And so that session, for want of a better word, it was very emotional. It was very hard not to get tearful. I cry quite easily, but it was kind of, I think that the fact that I had an instant rapport with James, I felt a sense of empathy from him from the moment I shook his hand. That made it possible for me to be completely open. From a technical perspective, he kind of sat behind a kind of confessional curtain, so to create an eye line with the camera. so it did feel like sitting in a confessional booth and talking to a priest, a hidden priest. Maybe that's a device that you guys use, but it was effective. It worked. And I think what's interesting about the edit, I mean, I remember saying those words, but I'm pretty certain that they've taken heartbeats and taken breaths and just kind of stretched my dialogue, and it's kind of come across with much more pathos and kind of weight than how I probably delivered it to camera, being kind to those guys and a differential to myself. But it's not something you can really impart to anyone else, other than I'd put it akin to kind of maybe telling somebody that you don't know very well your biggest secret, which you probably wouldn't feel comfortable telling a close friend or family member.
But I think what's so interesting
knowing
is
that the whole world's going to see it.
But that's so interesting, is that the idea that an interview can be a therapy session, so or a sort of confessional session, because I think, Steve, obviously you did some of the interviews in Thatcher, Liza, you did some of the interviews, probably did all of the interviews in Yorkshire Ripper. So Steve, that's a big responsibility if you are acting as priest meets therapist.
Priest meets Norman Tebbit.
Yeah.
Well, I did a bunch of the interviews, and the directors, James House and Stephen Finnegan, Pamela Gordon and Alice Perman, did fantastic interviews, I have to say, with, to be fair, a bunch of contributors who were very willing to talk. It wasn't as if we were having to wring the truth out of them. But all the directors, I think, brought a sort of a sensitivity to just extracting the moments of that got beyond politics talk, and just got them to be just that little bit more revealing about themselves, as much as about her, actually. But it is it's a big responsibility doing political people, just because they're very canny talk. They know what they're up to. They talk professionally. And they can be obviously very manipulative, and they can tell you as much as they really want to. So it's the challenge getting them to go beyond that. And I think one of the things that I enjoy about our series is that it feels like we've got a decent number of them to go beyond what they would normally say, or at least to deliver, deliver insights that were sort of occurring to them as they spoke, and that's something you don't usually get with political figures.
But do you recognise Mat's analogy with some of your contributors in Thatcher, that the idea that it was sort of therapeutic for them to do that interview, or are they just, or did you mostly experience them as sort of professional interviews?
No, a little bit of both, but therapeutic. I'm not sure about therapeutic, but what I felt was that sometimes as they spoke to us, they were having a final reckoning, and for some of them, I think the reason they did it was, they're all pretty old. They were having a final reckoning with this relationship that they'd had, this experience that they'd had with this extraordinary person, which has been at the centre of their lives. And they were working out with us what they felt about it and what they felt about her. And I think some of them will probably, their final moments on this earth, they'll be thinking about Margaret Thatcher, and not always in a good way. But it was really interesting to get close to people who were clearly thinking very hard about what they felt.
I mean, you've obviously dealt with people who were emotionally scarred by Margaret Thatcher in your interviews, but in terms of Assad, the Assad series, some of your interviewees were people whose lives had been endangered by the Assad regime. So in terms of those interviews, and I know you didn't conduct many of them yourself, what was their experience of talking? Do you recognise the comparisons, David?
Yeah, I mean, there's just a sort of sense of, sometimes you sort of realise you're stirring something which is pretty powerful. We just say to Matt, I'm glad you did that. I think it's brilliant. And I think that's what we all rely on, people being kind of, cool enough and brave enough to tell their story, and sort of, it's fantastic. But I suppose kind of with the Assad series, we had a thing where we would just kind of, our story was about the family partly, and we'd show a photo of the family to various contributors to talk about. And this journalist who knew Bashar and was later locked up by Bashar and sort of psychologically tortured, just sort of, and we put it at the start of the first episode, sort of looks at this photograph, and he can't, kind of tears well up in his eyes, and he can't really talk about it. And he sort of says, there's so much I could say about this. And you just have this kind of, he goes, you can look at it and look at it and look at it, and it's an incredible photograph. And you just sort of realize that you're dealing with very, very powerful things for people, almost sort of telling a story which you must treat a bit like hallowed ground. And there's a sort of, I suppose, I naively often sort of, stumble into programs thinking about how interesting they are, what a great story they are, and all that kind of thing. But when you kind of hit the reality of the people who have lived it, you always get a kind of, I always feel a slight sort of jolt, and then a kind of responsibility to sort of try and do them justice and all that stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think it was, there were some very, very powerful emotions that we were asking people to kind of bring out and talk about.
Shall we show a quick clip now from Assad's, just so you can see? That would be great. Their relationship goes from bad to worse.
Yes. I mean, I think it's a great choice of clip, that partly because it illustrates something, which kind of we try and get at, which is that sort of behind the scenes of the footage. And something we're always interested in is sort of trying to kind of show the front of house through the footage, and then sort of say what's really going on. And often really interesting with this kind of program that you can actually piece together from different accounts exactly what's happening on what day and all that kind of thing, and then take a sort of forensic interest in the kind of the behind the scenes story. And that's a really good example of it. I mean, you kind of, that footage of him meeting Hafez Assad, the dad, and sort of then knowing that the background to them smiling is his father that's just been killed by him, and and is sort of suddenly makes it extraordinary. Watching this footage at kind of two levels. It's also kind of, it's got that scene, I suppose, has a sort of Godfather films-like quality about it, and a lot of people make that parallel between the kind of the Godfather films and the Assad family, and sort of that sort of thing. They have that, I think that sort of that has that atmosphere, doesn't it? Of sort of that kind of murder and is part of the the way that they've interacted,
And beyond the obvious, which is that archive is available in ways that it's not been before, just sort of to everybody, but starting with you, David, why do you think there's been, because in some ways it's quite a traditional mode of storytelling, archive, intercut with testimony interviews. Why do you think there has been a resurgence of interest in that mode of storytelling?
Well, I think I think everyone here has sort of started to be involved in programs that use it in a slightly different way, and that usually archive was traditionally sort of used a bit as B-roll a bit, and you sort of, you have the talking heads and then cut to some B-roll. And what I think a lot of these films have done is sort of allow the viewer to sort of psychologically put down roots into a scene and live in the archive. And I sort of feel like in documentary, in a way, that's the best thing one can do, is almost give the viewer a sense that the deeper the roots, the more you feel like you're there, the more you feel like you're experiencing it, and you're with someone and you're kind of living it. A bit like that clip. You sort of, I think that's a whole nother level for how traditionally archive has been used. And then I think a lot of these stories also take sort of news footage, which uses the archive in one way, and sort of just kind of says, with a kind of journalist telling you what's happened. And says we're all more interested, I think, in kind of the rushes and kind of finding the stuff which kind of that the news at 10 might have just kind of discarded, but we're kind of interested of them, being mic'd up or whatever it might be. That kind of lets you see round the corner and puts roots down into the thing. And I guess yes.
Steve?
I think you get some weirdly revealing moments in those little kind of offcuts, and we really enjoyed finding those little warm-up moments where Thatcher is chatting to the Robin Day or David Dimbleby, and the just sort of the next episode starts with a moment like that, which is just very revealing about what she's going through beyond the sort of public presentation of power. And I think those are those can be really priceless, actually, and strangely revealing. I think there's and why these programs are getting kind of traction. I think that two things. I think we can't deny the power of the impact that the SVOD platforms have had and the accessibility to really good documentary that's available there. I think that just has allowed a broader range of people to see films that would normally have been kind of restricted to festivals, etc. And you know that those are made in different kinds of ways. And also I think that, and this is an interesting dilemma I think for all of us, I think there's an atmosphere of mistrust of the authoritative voice at the moment, generally. The presenter voice, the voice of God, and there is an appetite for people wanting to feel that they can make their own mind up. Present me with evidence, give me a picture of someone, paint a portrait, and let me feel what I think about that person or that subject. And I think that's something that's rich in dilemmas for us all, but is also an opportunity.
You mentioned that, Matt, that sense that what was attractive to you was that 360, rather than if the series had been presented to you as it's going to have a presenter and that presenter's going to interview you, would that have been less appealing to you? Is that a fire alarm? Lunchtime in Sheffield. Amazing.
Wow.
Wow. Does it cross the whole city? I love it.
This is zombie alert.
Guys, it's lunchtime. If they'd said, if James had come to you and said, so we're going to have a presenter,
right,
and he's going to he or she will come to your house and interview you, would that have felt less appealing?
As going into a process, I probably wouldn't have had an opinion. As a viewer, absolutely, it wouldn't have been as interesting or beguiling. I personally find it kind of bizarre that we have programming that is meant to be reality TV, which is clearly scripted, and then you have reality, which is kind of often kind of carefully edited to create a kind of narrative that suits the person that's creating it. So I'm not personally interested in hearing kind of a historian's kind of version of events, because that, to come to your point about trust, I don't trust that that's not necessarily going to be a part of someone's cultural agenda at that time. Therefore, it may or may not be the truth. But it's pretty hard to discount a number of contributors coming to the same opinion, speaking from their personal, physical, visceral experience. And then as an audience member, when all of those voices are put together, I'm allowed to kind of impartially kind of come to my own conclusion, as you've said. And to me, that's infinitely more interesting to both participate in, as in being aware that that's the context in which I'm kind of going to be heard, but also to watch.
I'm very aware that when the clips that we've chosen are probably all to some degree quite dark, inevitably, because of the subjects that we're covering. They cover big political moments, seismic moments in time, serious crimes. Do you think that there's is there ever a world, David, where you could apply some of these techniques to something that has a different tone, feels more upbeat, more mischievous, funnier? Because some of the things we're talking about today are very serious by the very nature of the subject.
Yes, definitely.
Good.
I'm sort of not. It's not quite the same. I'm currently doing something with Channel 4 about the moon landings, where we're sort of building it entirely out of archive as though it's live, and just the sheer nature of the footage. It's quite kind of just fun. You sort of watch people at Mission Control kind of smoking cigars and using kind of dinosaur technology, and it's kind of all just quite uplifting as sort of even the protesters outside the launch site at Cape Canaveral or wherever they are, their protesters are all protesting about what a waste of money, and when the rocket goes up, they all cheer. And it's kind of, and so there's just sometimes the subject matter itself really kind of defines the feel of a documentary. The only thing I'd say though is that sort of it's sometimes to be really compelling over a series. I think we sort of talk about sometimes touching base with the electric rail. That sort of these films can run on a sort of sense of some sort of seriousness or importance or something that's just electric. And I suppose sometimes when we were getting into Bashar and Asma Assad, if it ever became slightly gossipy, I remember talking to Simon and you about kind of like, sometimes we just need to remind the audience that this is sort of deeply serious stuff, but not just because we sort of have to morally, but also that kind of gave traction and momentum to the kind of, it was a sort of sense of it kept your attention. And I think it's probably harder to kind of go for, but I'm sure it's doable and it's interesting to try. I think the direction of travel of TV probably is that people are going to look for these kinds of things, slightly pleasurable spaces as well.
I'm very aware of time, so I wanted to open up to questions, if that's okay. So I think there are roving mics. God, there's a lot of questions. Okay, so can we start on this side? Can you put your hands up again? Sorry. And we've got this man in the green shirt here. There you go. Start with you. Sorry.
Shirt? Oh, well.
Hi.
Hi. Just coming back to the penultimate question about this renaissance in this type of programming. Can each one of the panelists say, was there a particular documentary that for them kicked that off?
Oh, God.
I mean, well, quite a few. I would say sort of my original interest in sort of box set documentaries, not archive-led, was Death on the Staircase, or The Staircase as it's known. And that led me to start experimenting in this kind of area and did a doc series called The Murder Detectives. And then in terms of archive, I think the O.J. Simpson, the O.J. Made in America is a kind of unbelievably good. And we're sort of just living in the shadows of that in a way. I just thought that was extraordinary and showed a way that over 7.5 hours you could tell a story using the archive, and often a story you might thought you'd know. So those two would be kind of, and there are others, but those two particularly.
Steve?
Yeah, I mean, the OJ film is obviously incredibly influential. The other one which I watched a lot before we started doing this and which I would recommend is Don Porter, the American director, made a series about Bobby Kennedy, which was a combination of really great archive and old people talking. And that doesn't sound that promising, but it was fantastic. And I think that, for me, gave me great confidence that old people talking with archive can really work.
Are there series that you've enjoyed or were influenced by?
I guess the context of participating in this, from a reassurance point of view, the fact that these guys have been worked on the Amy documentary very recently, so it was like a recent example of their work. Yeah. You're only as good as the most recent thing you've done. I felt that was quite impartial way of storytelling. And again, a story I thought I knew really well. I hung out in all the same places and rubbed shoulders with those people regularly, but I still didn't realise I didn't know the full story. So, yeah.
Liza?
I think the thing with the OJ series was it was so long, yet I was gripped throughout it, and I think it showed that if you've got the material there and the skill, you can tell it in such minute detail without losing the audience, I think, which, that was the one for me recently.
Okay, hands up again, sorry. So can we come to the front? And there's a lady here in a stripy top.
Hi, I'll try to be short. But you said something about Godfather and things like that. And during this, I made my notes, and I was wondering, everybody's making films about these evil people. And that's what I see in the society. I have a connection to each one of you, because I left this country when Margaret Thatcher came in. I worked on the first black thing called Pressure. I adopted a Syrian guy from Aleppo last year, and we would watch Al Jazeera, and he'd watch it. We'd watch it in Arabic, and he'd go, "That's not true, that's not true." So my question was, I haven't seen your series, I will catch up on it, but I like the point of view of people on the ground who were he was tortured and killed his family, everything. So he can tell you his story of the revolution. And, okay, so I'm sorry. I work with a guy called Marcel Offels, and he did a thing called War Correspondence. He analyzed the difference between British covering war, John Simpson, and the French, very emotional, very tender, you know, getting the people involved, and the Americans, which was John Pulitzer Prize winner, very objective and everything. And I'm just wondering, I come back to this country now, I live half-time here. This evil, this treating documentaries like, because you'll get more bums on seats when they're played as Godfather, this has had an impact on the society. We look at the evil people running for government, and this has, okay, make that into a question. Do you think that this has made people into a very negative, evil society?
Sorry, you mean?
I've pitched a lot of things to the BBC and Channel 4 and everything. If you make a Godfather figure or the murderer, you know, the fashion designer who got murdered by his gay lover, you'll get your money straight away to make your film. But if you make something serious, it won't. So this fascination with horror, with crime, with knifing, you know, it's different. I live in France and Germany. It's different there. You make it from a different angle.
I think that these are serious programs. I think if you watch all of these programs, that they are, even though they're taking sometimes very serious, very dark subject matter, they are shining a light of documentary on those areas. And I think there's sort of, I mean, you said a lot there in terms of you'd rather hear from the sort of people in Aleppo. I think there's room for that too. As I said, go and see Fasama, you know, it's an unbelievable documentary. But what we were trying to do was a specific thing of trying to understand it from another point of view, and it hopefully got people to watch and engage with a very serious subject matter. And I mean, all these films are rather serious documentaries. So I think we're in serious times, and that's part of the reason we're looking at these very sort of dark subject areas. I don't think there's a causal story between making documentaries about it and somehow polluting society. I think quite the opposite.
Why don't we make films about good people who show a role model for excellence rather than evil?
Well, I think we do. And also within these films, I think you have heroes within them. If you look at the Lawrence films. Yeah, I mean, I think there's heroes in all of these.
I think there's hope to be found in terms of light at the end of the tunnel. From my experience, and the story of Stephen, to sort of see how the case has evolved and how the impact it's had on our culture and on our country, I'm left, regardless, somehow, with a sense of hope that human nature will win out and that we are inherently good. And so even when you're presented with people that are on the darker side of the light, shall we say, you then are countered by seeing somebody that stands up to that, and it's definitely in your storytelling as well. There's, you know, the survivors, the family, and the survivors that they have a very positive kind of message, I believe, of surviving and that hope reigns. And you didn't focus. You deliberately did not focus on the negative character, the Ripper himself. You actually focused on the impact and how one can survive that. So I agree that maybe culture as a whole seems to be going down a negative rabbit hole, but I don't think it's necessarily the fault of these documentary makers. I think that's something to do with the wider cultural context.
I think there are documentaries that do what you say, but I don't think that any, not just because I'm here, but I don't think that any of these documentaries do. Like, I think ours very clearly didn't focus on the man, the serial killer. It focused on why these horrific things happened, which is something we've got to face, and something, that's the whole point of documentary, isn't it? To look at our society and to look at these horrific things that have happened and to have some kind of insight on them. And if you do it right, you don't have to focus on, you know, those elements of the story, really.
We've got time for 2 more questions, and I've got way too many hands for 2 more questions, so I'm sorry. Could we go to the lady at the front here with the glasses? Thanks.
I just wondered whether there's all of these have got a really clear sort of framing and a reason for being made, but I just wondered before you started whether you knew how many people you were willing to talk and how much, what the archive really offered, and or whether it was really just on the basis of the kind of framing and the why now that they got away?
That's a good question. I think that we kind of travelled in hope rather than expectation, and we're genuinely and very pleasantly surprised to see how willing people were to come forward and participate. Not just all of the big political beasts who were around then, who are still with us, and I think we basically got them all if they were alive, but also that kind of other layer of people who'd never spoken before in TV, certainly the civil servants, her bodyguard, her personal assistant. And with the archive, we knew there was obviously a very rich archive of kind of coverage of the political events of the period and coverage of her. So we could feel pretty confident right from the get-go that that material was there. But it's a good question about how you start these projects and how you commission these projects and how you have conversations with the commissioners about these projects, and about what you can sort of guarantee is the critical mass that's going to make you achieve something like this. And I think certainly one of the lessons I learned from it is that the more confident and the more considered you can be about that right at the start, the more convincing you're going to be in your conversation with the commissioners.
I think the concept for ours was key, really. It was a different way of looking at a case that had been looked at a million times before, and I think that was the reason it got commissioned. I mean, we knew that, like you say, we knew there was lots of archive, but there hadn't really been much archive research done, so we didn't have any idea, of the gems that we found. We didn't know they existed. I'd read about some of them, and then we found them, and obviously that was an amazing moment. And contributors, a lot of them had died, so it was definitely the concept that was the most important thing, I think.
And from a commissioning point of view, there's with series like this, there's an element of risk. I think that's true of all documentaries. It's not classic specialist factual in a way where you go, here's a running order and a script. You sort of go, you have to have a feel that it's the right thing and that we'll get there, and you hope that you've got such strong collaboration with the production team that you'll keep evolving what it is as it goes. I think all of these projects started out with a very strong sense of direction, but I think all ended up not entirely as they'd been conceived, which is quite right, I think. It would be sort of disappointing if it was like, and there it is, exactly as it was written on the page, and they really weren't that. We're going to do one more question, if that's all right. Okay, you put your hand up first, so it's the guy in the middle.
I watched your series, House of Assad. It's brilliant. One of the recent books, Sam Dagner, unfortunately shutting down access to the house after his expulsion. He's got now new book. Obviously, you got now a lack of access. However, your story may continue. Would you be able to think, for example, using animation or different techniques to narrate the most recent events? Also, I've got a sense of, in your narration, although there's a tragedy on the House of Assad and everything, there are so many faults and tricks in the family. However, underneath, you are aspiring, he is kind of evil. Maybe you don't mention psychopathic, because his rise is very implicitly heralding his future. I think this is incomplete story about his life. However, you can set up maybe a new balance in your story, because presently there are so many external forces like regime, Russian element, Iranian element, and his villain personality. So if you revisit again your project, in what sense would you be able to interpolate or glossary about this?
I think that there's a few things to say. I think that we got a very moving letter from someone who was in the series, who said, "I really liked it, but I wish there was a part 4." And I think you're sort of reflecting that, and that's a powerful thought. And we sort of hope there might be one day we will return to the story and hopefully a happier chapter in it. I don't think we'd do it in animation, but I'm sort of pleased you liked it, and I think that the story isn't over. The only thing I'd probably disagree with is your use of the word evil, because I don't think that's a helpful word, really. I kind of think that's too sort of... Well, I suppose that's one of the things, I suppose we just kind of, you know, in the word tragedy, the kind of the Greek word, the ancient Greek nature of the words, that somehow one brings about their own downfall, and it's one's own characteristic, and what it is in that person's character that brings about their own downfall, and you may see things in that. But I think evils are kind of too, and not a helpful word in a way. We're trying to just kind of show the story and the humanity. But I'm glad you liked it.
Thank you, everybody. So I just want to thank Nancy Bornat, who produced the session today, and all our panellists. Thank you for coming. Thank you.